At 3:12 p.m. local time, the Southern Caribbean looked almost too calm to be important. The sea was flat, the wind was light, and the afternoon sun hung pale over the open water. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. It was the kind of scene where everything appeared ordinary, almost routine. For the sailors aboard the U.S. carrier moving through international waters, it felt like another controlled transit. Every procedure was familiar. Every station had its rhythm. The ship moved forward with the same quiet confidence it had shown countless times before. Then the radar picture changed. Inside the ship's information center, one surface contact appeared to the southwest. A moment later, another appeared, then another. Within seconds, there were 5 separate returns on the display. They were low-profile hulls moving together in a formation that was too clean to be random. There was no AIS signal, no civilian identification, no friendly explanation. Just 5 sharp symbols moving across the screen with the kind of discipline that immediately demanded attention. The officer on watch leaned closer. The system began comparing speed, shape, direction, and electronic signatures. The answer came quickly. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels. They were not scattered. They were not simply passing through the area. They were closing the distance. Their speed increased from 14 knots to 18, then to 20. On the bridge of the carrier, nothing dramatic happened. The ship did not turn away. It did not speed up. It did not make any sudden move. It simply held its course. That was not hesitation. That was discipline. A message went out over an open frequency. Unidentified Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States Navy ship operating in international waters. State your intentions. There was no reply. A second message followed, shorter and firmer, repeated in Spanish. Still nothing. At 3:18 p.m., the closest point of approach updated again. 8 nautical miles and decreasing. This was no accident. Naval vessels do not drift into coordinated positions by chance. They maneuver, they adjust, they choose their angles carefully. Inside the information center, analysts watched the Venezuelan ships begin to separate slightly. One moved toward the carrier's port bow. 2 others widened toward the sides. The last pair remained behind, holding just enough distance to react. It was not a full surround yet, but it was moving in that direction. The carrier's posture stayed the same. No loud voices, no visible panic, no dramatic movement on deck, just quiet professionalism. Data was being collected, optics were tracking. Every signal from the approaching vessels was recorded, time-stamped, and stored. On deck, many sailors continued their duties without knowing the exact geometry forming miles away. That is how a carrier works. Calm on the surface, intense below. At 3:21 p.m., the distance dropped below 6 nautical miles. One Venezuelan vessel shifted slightly across the carrier's projected path. Close enough to be noticed, not close enough to cross a decisive line. It was a test. The captain did not react emotionally. Another message went out. Venezuelan naval vessels, your current maneuvering is unsafe. Alter course immediately. Again, silence. For the Venezuelan commanders, this was pressure without direct escalation. A message delivered through movement, presence, and distance. For the carrier, it was something else. Because while 5 vessels were visible on the surface, many unseen systems were already awake. Sensors were comparing information, analysts were identifying radar types, power levels, scan patterns, and the kind of details that only appear when another side comes close for too long. And the closer they came, the more they revealed. At 3:24 p.m., the carrier's air wing was quietly notified. Not to launch immediately, not to make a show, just to be ready. Procedure, not panic. On the radar display, the 5 Venezuelan vessels now formed a shallow arc ahead of the carrier's bow. Their intention was no longer difficult to read. They were closing in. No direct action had taken place, no harsh warning had been spoken, but the situation had changed. What began as a routine transit had become a deliberate confrontation. And this was only the beginning, because the response would not come through louder radio calls or sharper words. It would come from something Venezuela did not appear to expect. By 3:27 p.m., the geometry of the encounter was no longer subtle. The 5 Venezuelan vessels adjusted course again, making small, measured changes. To someone unfamiliar with naval movement, it might have looked like ordinary navigation, but inside the carrier's information center, it looked like a pattern. One vessel pressed forward, angling toward the carrier's projected route. 2 others moved outward, trying to control the space on each side. The remaining pair slowed slightly behind the group, not withdrawing, but managing their distance. This was not random movement, it was coordination. The closest vessel crossed inside 4 nautical miles, close enough to be clearly visible on the horizon, close enough for optics to identify hull markings, crew movement, and deck-mounted equipment. Still, there was no answer on the radio. The carrier maintained course and speed. That decision mattered. In naval encounters, the first side to make a major turn can appear uncertain. The first side to move away can lose control of the story. Here, the carrier did neither. It stayed steady, forcing every move by the approaching vessels to happen in full view, fully recorded, and without provocation. Inside the information center, officers tracked each contact down to the smallest change in speed. Bearings updated in real time. Closest point projections appeared across the screens. CPA, 2.9 nautical miles. Time to CPA, 6 minutes. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer simply approaching. They were pressing. On deck, nothing appeared unusual. Aircraft remained secured. The flight deck stayed quiet. There was no dramatic response, no visible escalation. That restraint was intentional. The message was not meant for cameras. It was meant for commanders watching data streams from a distance. At 3:31 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel cut slightly ahead of the carrier's bow. It was still within legal boundaries, but the signal was clear. The move created a decision point. Turn away and de-escalate visibly, or hold course and document everything. The carrier held. Another message went out, crisp and professional. Venezuelan naval vessels, you are operating in an unsafe manner. Maintain safe distance and alter course. Again, no reply. But something else happened. The carrier's monitoring systems picked up active scanning. Low-power surface search radar. Nothing dramatic enough to force an immediate response. Everything carefully measured to apply pressure without crossing an obvious line. A gray zone maneuver. For the carrier's crew, this kind of moment was familiar. These encounters are not always about who moves first. They are about who stays disciplined longer, who collects the better record, who controls the pace without losing initiative. At 3:34 p.m., the arc tightened. The 5 Venezuelan vessels now formed a shallow semicircle ahead of the carrier. Their wakes cut clean lines through the water. Not blocking, not colliding, just close enough to send a message. You are being watched, you are not welcome. What will you do? The carrier's answer was still the same. Nothing visible. But inside the information center, a different response was unfolding. High-resolution optics focused on bridges, deck areas, and onboard systems. Electronic patterns were categorized. Signals were compared against known databases. Every second the vessels stayed close, the picture became clearer. And that was the irony. By closing in, the Venezuelan vessels were not gaining control over the carrier. They were giving it more information. At 3:37 p.m., flight operations quietly shifted from routine to ready. No alarms, no public announcements, just crews moving with purpose, preparing options without advertising intent. Because at this stage, the carrier did not need to display strength. It already had it. And the longer the 5 vessels stayed close, silent, and coordinated, the more the balance shifted. What looked like pressure from the surface was becoming something very different. A controlled exposure. And the moment was approaching when that reality would become impossible to ignore, because the next move would not come from the bridge, it would come from above. At 3:39 p.m., the carrier made its first visible move. It was not a turn. It was not an increase in speed. It was something more deliberate. Flight operations went active. On the edge of the deck, a Seahawk helicopter rolled forward. Its rotors began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, building into a steady blur. There was no dramatic announcement across the ship, no loud signal, no sudden change in atmosphere. To an untrained observer, it might have looked routine. It was not. This was the turning point. As the helicopter prepared to lift off, the 5 Venezuelan vessels held their positions. Their formation remained intact. Their radios stayed quiet. From the surface, it may have looked like they still had control. From above, the picture was about to change completely. The Seahawk lifted cleanly into the air and moved low over the water, climbing just enough to clear the carrier's bow before banking outward. Its sensors came online at once. Optics, infrared, surface tracking. Live imagery began flowing back to the ship's information center. Every deck, every radar mast, every movement. At 3:41 p.m., the helicopter closed to visual range of the lead Venezuelan vessel, close enough to identify movement on the bridge, close enough to see personnel shift along the rail. Still, there was no hostile action. Still, there was no communication. The helicopter did not fly aggressively. It did not crowd the mast. It did not dive toward the deck. Instead, it held a steady orbit, calm, controlled, unmistakable. This was not intimidation. It was presence. Inside the information center, analysts watched the data build second by second. The radar emissions from the Venezuelan vessels were now unmistakable. Scan rates, frequencies, patterns, all of it was being logged, compared, and stored. The message was quiet, but clear. You came close. Now we see you clearly. At 3:43 p.m., something changed. One Venezuelan vessel adjusted speed slightly. Another changed heading by a few degrees. Small moves, but hesitant ones. The kind of movements that suggest someone is recalculating. Pressure works both ways. The Seahawk widened its orbit, keeping all 5 vessels within sensor range. From above, the geometry looked different. The shallow arc that had formed ahead of the carrier no longer appeared confident. It looked less balanced, less certain. Then came the quietest escalation of all. A precise visual signal appeared across the bridge windows of the nearest Venezuelan vessel. Not contact, not direct action, just a clear, controlled cue. "We have eyes on you. Every move is being recorded." The helicopter crew transmitted a short message on an open frequency. Calm, professional, measured. "Venezuelan naval vessels, you are maneuvering unsafely in international waters. Alter course and maintain safe distance." The message was repeated in Spanish. This time there was movement. Crew members on one Venezuelan vessel pulled back from a deck position. Another ship's wake shortened, an early sign of reduced speed. Not a retreat, not yet, but no longer an advance. On the carrier's bridge, nothing changed. Course held, speed steady. The captain watched the surface picture without comment. There was no need to rush the moment. This encounter was not about forcing a dramatic ending. It was about letting reality settle in. By 3:47 p.m., the Venezuelan formation had started to lose its shape. The arc loosened. The trailing vessels drifted wider. The lead vessel eased away from its sharper angle. For the first time since contact began, the pressure was no longer coming from 5 vessels on the surface. It was coming from one aircraft above them, silent, recording, unavoidable. What had started as a surface maneuver had turned into an information imbalance. Every second the helicopter remained in the air, the cost of staying close increased for Venezuela, while the benefit continued to fade. The carrier never raised its voice, it never changed course, it never made a dramatic gesture. But the message was unmistakable. This was no longer a standoff. It was a decision point. And the next few minutes would determine whether this encounter ended quietly or became a mistake that could not easily be explained. By 3:49 p.m., the balance had changed completely. The 5 Venezuelan vessels were still there, still visible on radar, still close enough to matter. But the energy was different. The tight coordination that had defined their earlier movements was beginning to break apart. Their formation no longer moved like one unit. The numbers told the story. One vessel dropped from 21 knots to 18. Another eased away from its intercept angle, opening more space to the carrier's starboard side. The trailing pair widened their separation, moving far enough to avoid committing to the next step. None of it was announced, none of it was admitted over the radio. But inside the carrier's information center, every detail was logged in real time. Bearings, speeds, wake length, heading changes. The picture was clear. This was hesitation. Above them, the Seahawk continued its wide orbit, keeping all 5 vessels within view. It did not chase, it did not pressure them directly, it simply remained in position. Calm, visible, unavoidable, pressure without aggression. At 3:52 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel made its first clear turn away from the carrier's projected path. Only a few degrees, but enough to break the intercept geometry. It was the first visible concession. The carrier held course. Another radio call went out. Short, professional, unemotional. "Venezuelan naval vessels, your movements are being recorded. Maintain safe distance and alter course." This time there was a reply. It was faint, controlled, and carefully worded. The Venezuelan bridge acknowledged operating near what it described as a sovereign patrol area and requested that the U.S. vessel adjust its heading. The carrier's response came immediately. "United States Navy vessel conducting lawful transit in international waters. We will maintain course and speed." No argument, no escalation, just fact. From that moment, the outcome was no longer difficult to predict. By 3:55 p.m., the closest Venezuelan vessel had increased separation to more than 5 nautical miles. The trailing vessels began to follow. Their wakes lengthened as they eased away from their previous posture. The arc that once pressed forward dissolved into loose, non-committal positions. The Seahawk made one final pass. Not low, not aggressive. Just enough to confirm posture and capture the final imagery needed to complete the record. Then it climbed slightly and maintained overwatch while the distance continued to grow. On the carrier, flight operations stood down as quietly as they had begun. No celebration, no announcement, no visible victory. Just a return to readiness. This was not a dramatic retreat for Venezuela. It was something more subtle and in some ways more revealing. They had reached the limit of pressure without consequence. Beyond that point, every option carried risk. Legal risk, political risk, operational risk. And the longer they remained close, the worse that calculation became. By 3:58 p.m., the Venezuelan vessels were no longer maneuvering toward the carrier at all. They held parallel courses, increasing distance minute by minute. The encounter had shifted from confrontation to disengagement. No direct clash, no alarms, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet recognition of reality. In gray zone encounters, the decisive moment is not always loud. It is not always visible to the public. Often, it is the moment one side realizes that continuing no longer serves its interests. The carrier never chased them. It never taunted them. It never followed their withdrawal. It did not need to. By staying steady, by letting discipline do the work, it had taken control of the story, the evidence, and the outcome. And as the distance widened, one thing became clear. The encounter was over. But the message it sent was only beginning to travel. By 4:06 p.m., the surface picture had settled. The 5 Venezuelan vessels remained visible on radar, but the distance was growing steadily. 7 nautical miles. Then 8. Their headings now ran parallel to the carrier's track. No longer intersecting, no longer testing, no longer pressing. Engines eased back. Wakes became thinner and more uniform. There were no sudden bursts of speed, no sharp course changes. The encounter was finished. On the carrier's bridge, nothing marked the moment. No announcement, no visible shift in posture. The ship continued forward at the same speed it had held from the beginning, its bow cutting through calm water as if the last hour had never happened. Inside the information center, however, the work was only entering its next stage. Every second of the encounter had been captured. Radar logs, optical imagery, electronic signatures, time-stamped radio calls, messages that were answered, messages that were ignored. Together, the data told a complete story. 5 vessels approached, 5 vessels coordinated, 5 vessels stepped away. No dramatic escalation was required. That outcome was not accidental. It was the result of a doctrine refined over decades, one that treats restraint not as weakness, but as leverage. In modern naval encounters, the objective is not always to overpower the other side. Often the objective is to control escalation, preserve legitimacy, and make the other side carry the burden of every aggressive move. In this case, that burden grew heavier with every mile Venezuela closed. By approaching without communication, they created risk. By maneuvering assertively, they created evidence. By staying close, they revealed systems and patterns they did not need to show. And when the moment came to decide whether to continue or step back, the calculation changed. Because escalation does not happen in darkness. It happens under observation. The carrier did not pursue the Venezuelan vessels as they moved away. The Seahawk returned to the deck, its rotors slowed, its sensors powered down. Flight operations returned to routine. Sailors resumed their work without ceremony. Professional restraint cuts both ways. For Venezuela, the message was clear. Pressure has limits. And when those limits are reached, the side that remains disciplined usually controls the outcome. For the carrier and its crew, this was not a moment for celebration. It was confirmation. The system worked. Procedures held. A political signal did not become a strategic mistake. These moments rarely make headlines. There is no dramatic footage, no explosive ending, no scene built for instant attention, but they matter. Because some of the most important confrontations at sea today are not battles. They are tests. Tests of judgment, tests of patience, tests of control. They unfold in international waters where every movement is watched, every signal is recorded, and every decision can echo far beyond the horizon. This encounter in the Southern Caribbean ended the way many of the most serious ones do. Quietly, professionally, without force. But it left behind something more lasting than noise. A record and a reminder. At sea, power is not measured only by how close you can get. It is measured by how confidently you can hold your course, how calmly you can control the moment, and how clearly you can make the other side decide that moving away is the smartest choice.